In the study of any book, the Bible, we need to move beyond just, say, the words on the paper and what we necessarily understand. Now, most of us are not speakers of the original language of scriptures. That's not a problem. Multiple English translations help us effectively understand the underlying text. But one of the goals of the scripture and its study is to get a sense of what is being said beyond the words. What is the literary style? What does the construction of the book say? What about its time and place? There's a number of these issues to flush out what is going on within the text itself. And I kind of say that as a prelude to this reading, this selection, because it's a case in which we need to kind of stand back and see what is going on in a little larger picture. I'm going to be just reading two verses, but you'll notice I'm going to read them from two different chapters and several verses apart. They are found in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 19. I will begin with that, and I will be reading from the New Testament in Modern English by J.B. Phillips. In a sense, J.B. Phillips' translation is equivalent to Peterson's translation, The Message, just from a different era in terms of purpose and focus. Matthew chapter 14 and verse 19 says, he told the crowds to sit down on the grass. That's the command of Jesus. And then over to chapter 15, verse 35. Then Jesus told the crowd to sit down comfortably on the ground. When reading the Gospels, we are not always sure about the time involved. An event may follow another event in the narrative, but that may not indicate that those events happened on the same day. We have already talked about how Matthew has gathered the teaching of material of Jesus into several large blocks within his Gospel. We are not even really sure how long Jesus' ministry is. The Gospel of John records 3 Passovers, and so that lends support for the idea of Jesus' ministry being about 3 years. In point of fact, it is only really the last week of Jesus' ministry, which kicks off with Palm Sunday and ends with Easter Sunday, that we really can construct with a fair amount of certainty a week in the life of Jesus. There are 2 major events in Jesus' ministry where crowds were fed, 2 that are recorded. In each case, there is given the approximate number of adult males present. So if we take account to the women and children also present, that number may be 3 or 4 times higher in terms of who was actually fed. We are talking in these miraculous healings a significant number of people present. Given the size of crowds involved, I do wonder how much the people that were present and fed realized what was happening. Did they really know what Jesus had did? Because understand, if you have a crowd feeding of 5,000, and if that is more like a feeding of 15 to 20,000, you know that out on the peripheral of the crowd, they wouldn't have been actually able to see what Jesus was doing. They understood that they got fed, but maybe not necessarily how they got fed. We will see in time that the 2 feedings, the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, while very similar and can be read on the surface as the same sort of event, they were in point of fact very different. And we will explore the fact that the feeding of the 5,000 actually was the more important of the 2. Now, I've given you 2 verses here to look at. And these 2 verses are important because they seem to be time markers. Chapter 14 to chapter 15 is only 1 chapter, but is it a short period of time in between? In the part of the world that Jesus worked in, grass was green in the spring. So this seems to be a significant point, that the feeding of the 5,000 was when? In the spring. And it clearly wasn't in the winter, because the winter was the rainy season, not the time to gather out in the crowd, out in the fields. Well, then you have the summer. The summer was hot and dry, and there goes the grass. The second feeding, according to Phillips, they sat on the ground. Why ground? Because there was no grass. And that seems to be a marker that it's summer, and probably late summer at that. The two feedings were some 3 or 4 months apart. Thus, they are two events close together in Matthew, but not close together in time. Don't push me on this, but one, I think, can look backwards to the glories of Jesus' ministry past, and one looks forward to the darker tones of his ministry to come. Jesus' ministry may have been 3 years. Again, we base this on the fact that John gives us 3 Passovers. So he mentions Passover 3 different times in his gospel, ergo 3 different years. But the problem is we're not really sure if John was written chronologically. He might have been written thematically. It's not impossible. It doesn't lessen the reality of the story he tells. And so if there's 3 Passovers, one of those Passovers may refer to an earlier Passover in his gospel. So the fact that Jesus' ministry is 3 years is not something we can etch in stone. But we will work off of it. If Jesus' ministry was 36 months at most, and you have these 2 feedings 3 or 4 months apart, then you begin to realize that this is a significant movement of time within the ministry of Jesus. If you only have 36 months in total, 3 or 4 months, that's a good chunk. And what we're saying here is that Jesus' ministry progressed very fast from the feeding of the 5,000 to the feeding of the 4,000. The 2 feedings are different because of the changes that happened in Jesus' ministry. And the same way, if you start a job at 20, it's not going to be the same thing as starting a job at 30. At 20, you may be only taking care of yourself. At 30, you may be taking care of a young family. At 20, you have all sorts of future dreams and goals. At 30, this might be the career job you've been looking for. Yes, you have some of the same feelings, but the job at 30 will come with a different set of expectations. It could be the career move or the need to support a family. So yes, the feedings are similar, but do not read them as the same event repeated.